Redfin's latest report showed that home buyers are canceling contracts in record numbers. But if you don't read past the headlines, you might miss the real story. While the national numbers show a massive increase in contract cancellations, this is actually only happening in a few cities, and the cancellations in those cities are skewing the national numbers, making it look like this is happening everywhere. But it's not. In today's video, I'll show you exactly how high contract cancellations have gotten, and I'll show you which cities have the highest and the lowest rates of cancellations. Then we're gonna look at 5 criteria that influence how likely a city is to experience this wave of cancellations: the median home price, geographical location, politics, economic diversity, and whether or not the city is a destination city. Jason Walter recently released this video about home buyers canceling contracts in record numbers.
Reached a new all-time record high.
I watched it, then I read the Redfin report he was referencing, and it's true that buyers are canceling contracts, and it's also true that those rates of cancellation are extremely high right now. 54,000 home purchase agreements were canceled in October. That was 17.2% of contracts, and with the exception of the blip of cancellations in March 2020, when COVID lockdowns first started, it's the highest Redfin has seen since they began keeping records in 2017. And the COVID cancellations were reactionary and very short-lived, not connected to any metrics in the housing market. Contract cancellations are a normal part of the real estate process, but when they get too high, it can be an indication of something that's skewed within the market. There are a lot of reasons people cancel contracts. Sometimes they just get cold feet. They watch YouTube videos about housing market crashes and worry that they'll get caught up in the mix of it. Sometimes buyers aren't happy with the inspection report, especially with our current low affordability. Buyers can be more sensitive to repair items. When homes are so expensive, they don't want to have to spend more money after moving in. But I think the biggest reason people cancel contracts is in new home sales, and this is probably playing a big part in what's happening now, especially because new home sales are such a big percentage of current inventory. The reason new home sales are more affected by contract cancellations is because mortgage rates can change significantly from the time a buyer goes under contract to the time the house is complete. If you were a buyer who went under contract 6 months ago for a new construction home, mortgage rates were almost a point lower when you went under contract, but you couldn't lock the rate then because the house wasn't built yet. Your lender will usually lock in your rate in the last 30 days of construction, so with rates going up so much, you're getting a mortgage rate that's much higher than what you initially qualified for. For new construction in my area, this is probably going to cost you an extra $300 to $400 a month. This could easily throw off your debt to income ratio, so you can no longer qualify for that loan, and then you would be forced to terminate the contract. Knowing where this is happening is really important because contract cancellations can be a harbinger of coming market crashes. Not always, like in March of 2020 when COVID hit, contract cancellations spiked, but it was just due to nervousness and buyers being unsure what was getting ready to happen, and we now know that the market didn't crash, it did the opposite. But back in 2008 and the years that followed, contract cancellations skyrocketed. Unfortunately, we don't have any data before 2017. This wasn't something people tracked back then. We didn't know it was important, but consider this anecdotal story to demonstrate how widespread contract cancellations were during that market crash. I bought a home in 2003, and then I bought another one in 2012. I didn't get my real estate license until 2015, but in 2003 in North Carolina, when I bought that home, if you terminated a contract, there were essentially no consequences. Your earnest money deposit was refunded and you went on your way. When I bought my home in 2012, the rules had changed. In addition to the earnest money deposit, I had to submit a secondary deposit called the due diligence deposit. This was a non-refundable deposit that went directly to the seller and was deposited in their bank account when I signed the initial purchase contract. Fast forward to 2015 when I went to real estate school and I found out that the standard offer to purchase and contract in North Carolina was changed after the housing crash because so many people were canceling contracts. They wanted to make the contract more balanced between both parties because sellers were really sustaining a lot of damage because of the contract cancellations, and that contract is supposed to be equally fair to buyers and sellers. So they added this deposit just to make sure that buyers had some skin in the game when making an offer. So while we don't have data on the rate of those cancellations, they must have been pretty high to get the Real Estate Commission and the Association of Realtors to change the contract in that way. Fortunately, Redfin shows us the rate of contract cancellations in the 50 most populous cities. If you're interested in cities other than the top 50, I've got some great data for you that I pulled myself, and we'll look at that in just a minute. But first, the Redfin cities. The 5 cities with the largest increase in contract cancellations cancellations were Sacramento, Virginia Beach, New York City, Cincinnati, and then 3 cities tied for position 5, Chicago, Detroit, and Seattle. But like I said, not all cities experienced an increase in cancellations. In fact, in most cities, the percentage of contract cancellations actually dropped significantly year over year. The cities with the largest decrease in contract cancellations were Austin, Texas, Charlotte, North Carolina, West Palm Beach, Florida, and then we had several ties for positions 4 and 5, San Antonio, Montgomery County, PA, and Jacksonville, Florida. There's a link in the description with the full list. What's crazy about this is places like Austin are places where people believe the market is set to crash, but when you look at the data I'm going to show you, you'll see why it's a lot more stable than people think. The problem with the Redfin list is it's limited to the top 50 cities by population, and I don't know about you, but I want to know where my city stands, and while I don't have the specific percentages for contract cancellations, I did gather some really fascinating data showing what city characteristics can influence contract cancellations and subsequently show housing market instability or stability. Back in 2008, the crash was not experienced across the board. Some cities did not have big decreases in values while others had massive drops. I think the same will be the case this time, and I think this data will help us tell which ones could be on the chopping block. I popped the Redfin data into a spreadsheet so we could get a little more granular with it, and this is when I made my first discovery. Only 20 cities actually saw an increase in contract cancellations, but 30 saw a decrease in cancellations from the same month last year. 20 seem to be on the brink of a housing crash, and 30 cities are showing resilience in the housing market. I'm going to call these two groups the resilient group and the struggling group, referring to their housing markets. What do the resilient cities and the struggling cities have in common? Let's look at the 5 characteristics that can influence a city's housing market resistance. I started by checking the median home price for each city. I know that many people think home prices are a big factor in a housing market crashing. People reason that if homes get too expensive, people can't afford to buy them, which seems to make sense, but I actually found the opposite to be true. Both the average and the median home price of the struggling cities was lower. Prices are higher, both the average and the median, in the more resilient cities. Now, this doesn't mean that price is the cause of a housing market crash or not. It's simply the effect of a city having the kind of characteristics that make people want to buy a house in that city. Desirable cities have more competition and higher prices. But what makes them desirable? The next thing I looked at was geography. The green text are resilient cities and the orange text are struggling cities. This visual makes it look like there's a connection between the city's location, whether the real estate market is resilient or struggling. The Midwest shows up big in contract cancellations, and so does the West. Now I wanted to look at climate and lifestyle. Do the cities that have more sunny weather or vacation type lifestyles have more resilient real estate markets? It turns out that there's a slight correlation between whether the city is a vacation destination or not. 58% of the cities that did not have great weather or vacation destinations were resilient, compared to 70% of cities that were vacation destinations. So there were more cancellations in cities that didn't have some kind of attraction, such as incredible weather or being the country music capital or something like that. The next thing I looked at was politics. Y'all just settle down out there. If you listen to any news, you know that everyone thinks their political party is better at running a city. The truth is, this one's really hard to tell because this was a look at the 50 largest cities, which naturally controlled for politics. 92% of them are liberal. However, I did find some mild connections when I grouped them by their city and state affiliation. So I divided the cities into 4 groups: liberal cities in a liberal state, liberal cities in a conservative state, conservative cities in a conservative state, and moderates, which the way I grouped them meant either the city or the state was split down the middle. I also didn't take into account recent changes because I figure if policy is an indicator of real estate market resilience, a recent change in voting probably hasn't trickled down to policy yet. I found that the least resilient real estate markets were the moderate cities or states where voting was split down the middle. This group had the most cities with contract cancellations. This actually surprised me. The next least resilient were liberal cities in liberal states. The next least resilient after that were liberal cities in conservative states. And finally, the most resilient real estate markets were conservative cities in conservative states. And I'm just presenting information here, so use your nice voice in the comments. Again, by resilient, I mean these are the cities where we are not seeing spikes in buyers terminating contracts. Now, before you get riled up, I'm not trying to prove anything here. I'm just looking for connections to see what we can learn. So now let's look at how economic diversity can impact how resilient a real estate market is. I divided the cities into 2 groups based on the diversity of their economies. Cities with a wide range of industries, including technology, finance, health, healthcare, education, and others I considered as having diverse economies. Cities heavily reliant on one or two sectors like manufacturing or agriculture I considered as having less diverse economies. Now, again, since we're looking at the top 50 cities by population, there's some selection for diverse economies already built in. Cities with less diverse economies do tend to shrink or not grow in the first place, so it was no surprise that 43 of our 50 cities had diverse economies. But if you look at the percentage of struggling cities in each group, you can see that there is certainly a correlation here. 33% of cities with diverse economies are struggling, but 86% of cities with a more uniform economy is struggling and had spiking contract cancellation rates. You could argue that the data is not statistically significant for either the economic diversity or the politics criteria, and that would probably be a fair argument. But what I do think this data tells us is that no single criteria tells us if a market is going to experience instability. I would have to do more research, but it's my hypothesis that the more of these categories associated with resilience that a city falls into, the less likely it is to see a housing crash. But even more interesting would be applying these criteria to up-and-coming towns, which I did in this video about a small town that became a housing market powerhouse.